From climate change to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, world leaders at the United Nations are addressing some of the biggest crises of our time. Hello, I'm Anton, and this is The Heat. The 77th UN General Assembly is underway in New York. The general debate begins on Tuesday and runs through Monday with speeches from 157 heads of state and representatives of governments, including China and the United States. We'll hear from our distinguished panel in just a moment, but first, my interview with Ambassador Csaba Korosi, the new president of the UN General Assembly, about this year's most pressing issues and challenges. Ambassador Korosi, thanks so much for joining us. You have just assumed the presidency of the United Nations General Assembly. What do you see as the UN's main challenges right now?
First of all, thank you much for having me. We are in the middle of a crisis time, and it is the most complex, most multi-layered, most multifaceted crisis that has tested international relations, tested international trade, and eroded trust among member states. It's a very dangerous mixture. It is the most complex, most challenging situation what the international community, including the United Nations, have ever faced in the last 40 years.
Those are big challenges that you're talking about there. How do you propose they be resolved right now?
If there would be an expectation to bring a magic wind and solve the big issues within 1 year, I think it would be an unfounded expectation. But my suggestion to the member states who accepted it was, let's dedicate this year to solutions through solidarity, sustainability, and science.
Now, you did address the United Nations General Assembly, and you said that the world will see increased conflicts as the planet heats up and its natural resources grow scarcer. How does the global community try to get to resolve those problems right now? What are the first steps they can take?
It's indeed, we are in a danger zone. We are on the path of 3 Celsius by the end of this century. Unless we can change it, the consequences will be dire. So the first, what we need to do is to change this path, to walk the talk in terms of finances, in terms of financing the climate policies. We need to involve science as much as we can in our preparations. And last but not least, we need to integrate water and science policies. 80% of the impact of the climate change is felt through water. Water is going to be our next major challenge, as we have seen already in Pakistan and as we have seen already in California or Europe and many other parts of the world.
The shortage of water, of course, is a challenge that will affect every single human being. Can you give us a sense of how serious this shortage is, and how does one try to get the world to get a sufficient supply of water?
Shortage is one of the 3 major problems what we can have with water. We have the major problems are when we have too little water, too much water, or polluted water. But you are absolutely right. Shortage is affecting now more than 1 billion people on Earth. By 2040, 40% of the humanity will live in an area where significant, very significant water shortage can be expected, and these areas will be provided more than 40% of the grain we have to produce. We need rethinking the water management policies. We need to think in terms of integrated water management, and I think sooner or later we'll have to create the global water information system to help member states to answer very simple questions, but very important questions. How much and what kind of water are we going to have in a given country, in a given region, in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, or 15 years' time? And what were the consequences of that water shortage or water availability for developing our economies.
When you say we need new thinking, are you talking about new conservation measures, or are you talking about new sources of water, perhaps new technologies that could provide us with more water?
All included, but let's take in a big picture. We are in a new era. We have to acknowledge it. Pandemic brought us challenges that were integrated, that linked to each other, and it revealed how vulnerable we are. Actually, it was a postcard from the future. A postcard from the future, what we can call Anthropocene era. So in a way, it is a prototype of the Anthropocene era crisis, when various fields of our existence, social, economic, industrial, energy producing, food producing, are becoming much more vulnerable than what we imagined they could be 10, 15 years ago. If we can change our water management, if we can change some breakthrough methodologies in our water management, we have a good chance. We cannot let this year go without major changes on our water management policies.
The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, he recently traveled to Pakistan, which, as we are all aware, is a country devastated by monsoon rains and flooding as well. Let's listen to part of what the Secretary General had to say.
I have seen an epic human tragedy here in Pakistan, but I also have seen the future. As our planet continues to warm, all countries will increasingly suffer losses and damage from climate beyond their capacity to adapt. Today is Pakistan. Tomorrow it could be your country, wherever you live. This is a global crisis. As the Minister said, it demands a global response.
So, Ambassador, there have been several major international conferences on the battle against climate change under the auspices of the United Nations. There is a blueprint out there on how to tackle this issue. Why has it been so difficult to implement much of that program?
Climate change and the water crisis are the most complex crises we are facing now. They are involving all walks of life, industrial, social, political lives, and they are demanding a lot of sacrifices. We have to take it very seriously. What the Secretary General said is basically indicating that the water crisis has started. It is not a promise of the future. It is present. It has started already. And it is going only worse because, let's remind ourselves, on the global warming, we are at 1.1 Celsius today. If we don't change trajectories, we shall be at 3 Celsius by the end of the century. And the increase is not linear. The increase and the effects of the increase are much more serious.
Ambassador, I want to turn now to the conflict in Ukraine, something that is dominating world headlines, and of course something that is also placing huge question marks over security in Europe. You said in your address to the UN that the conflict in Ukraine has been a turning point and that unless the world is vigilant, this type of warfare could become, quote, part of the toolkit of international life. What did you mean by that?
The United Nations Charter is very clear on that. The Article 1 is basically outlawing war, outlawing aggression against any other country. What we see now, as it has been stated and decided by the membership of the General Assembly in early March, that one member state has committed an armed aggression against its neighbor. It's a new era. It's a new era because it's a member of the Security Council. It's a new era because it is in the heart of Europe, where everybody thought war could be delegated to the pages of the history books. Now it's back. I hope that very soon we can see the end of hostilities, reach ceasefire. We would like to support the humanitarian efforts, humanitarian access to those who are suffering, alleviate human suffering as soon as possible, and reach peace as soon as possible. This is the only way. War cannot bring stability, war cannot bring development, and war cannot be a predictable future on this planet.
Why do you think there's not been a more vigorous effort to resolve this conflict diplomatically? Instead, what we're seeing are Western nations, led by the United States, pouring more and more weapons into Ukraine, which is ensuring that this war continues and also that more people will die.
Well, I cannot speak on behalf of the United States, of course. I can speak to a certain extent on behalf of the UN, and I would like here to commend the efforts of the Secretary General and the UN agencies. They are working day and night, and the humanitarian efforts, humanitarian alleviation of suffering produced very good results. Due to the UN efforts jointly with Russia, Ukraine and Turkey, there is a deal now how alleviation of hunger dangers in many other parts of the world could be eased through the export permissions that were reached among those actors through Black Sea from Ukraine and Russia. I think that deal should be fully explored, including the fertilizers, including components of fertilizers, and if we can reach that, the immediate danger of hunger could be lifted. With the fertilizer exports, the chances of the next year food production could also be increased.
And of course, the issue that we're talking about has been exacerbated by the pandemic, and you pointed out in your address that the pandemic, although more manageable, continues to wreak havoc across the globe, along with acute food insecurity, soaring energy prices, record inflation, and global supply chain disruptions. We need to reform, you say. How do you see that reform taking place?
We need to understand what happened to us. It was not just a virus. It was not just a disease. This pandemic taught us very dear lessons. Within weeks, our supply chains were cut. Within weeks, our cooperation systems became very vulnerable, very fragile. And within a few weeks, labor markets start suffering. And within a few months, sovereign debts started skyrocketing. So what the pandemic caused was basically a huge, complex crisis in all countries, to different levels, but in all countries. So it is not just a medical issue, it's a very complex political, security, medical, financial and social issue. If we want to address this very complex crisis, we need to have very complex, integrated approach to our crisis management systems.
Ambassador, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you indeed for having me.
For more now on this week's UN General Assembly, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Anton Fedyashin. He's a professor of history at American University. Also with us is James P. Moore. He's the founder and CEO of the Washington Institute for Business, Government and Society. And from Beijing, Victor Gao is a chair professor at Soochow University. Welcome to all of you. Victor, as this year's General Assembly gets underway, of course, as you just heard, the world is facing a host of challenges right now. From the conflict in Ukraine, there's more problems, there's rising inflation, food price hikes, we heard about the pandemic, and of course, we've had the climate change problem for some time right now. We've heard the Secretary General of the United Nations talk about his concerns over these crises. He's called for the world to put aside their differences and to come up with concrete plans to tackle these issues. Do you think world leaders are going to heed that call, or are we going to see more division with these crises just getting worse?
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, the world is indeed in the mode of crisis, and you are talking about compounding one crisis after another, and this level of crisis combined with other crises is rarely seen in the post-Second World War period. Secondly, all these crises cannot be done without political will at the highest level. You are not only talking about political will by every member state, but more importantly, all the way up at the level of the United Nations and its Security Council. However, there is also a high level of paralysis, politically speaking, especially involving the United Nations Security Council, because now of paramount importance, mankind is faced with this war and peace crisis. So this is really tough. It is easier said than done, and I'm afraid this year's General Assembly probably will listen to a lot of good speeches, but whether they will be translated into concrete actions, whether, for example, they can make sure that mankind will survive this whole series of crises one after another, is another issue. We need to make the right choice, but the end result is very uncertain right now.
Victor, the Chinese Foreign Minister and State Councillor Wang Yi, he will be addressing the General Assembly on Saturday. What is the message that he will be bringing to the gathering?
Well, in this period of one crisis after another, what China brings to the globe is a sense and a commitment for stability and development. And this requires a tremendous amount of judgment, of observation about what exactly is the nature of all these different crises, and also a keen understanding of what will be required to resolve them. So I will not be surprised if State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi will talk about what China stands for. That is, in times of war and peace, China should stand by the side of peace. In times of crisis after another, for example, China needs to contribute to finding out the root causes of all these problems and crises. So China will be a voice of rationality, sanity, and scientific observation and exploration for real solutions.
James, President Biden will be addressing the UN General Assembly on Wednesday. He's expected to call for unity in support of Ukraine. Now, to date, the United States has supplied something like $10 billion worth of weapons to Ukraine. In fact, it's paid U.S. defense contractors to supply those weapons to Ukraine. What are your expectations for that speech on Wednesday?
Well, I do think that that President Biden is going to certainly underscore the fact that many of our problems, including climate change, have been aggravated by the decision of one man to be able to go and invade Ukraine. Effectively, for example, in trying to get fertilizer, if it's not available anymore from Ukraine, it's a matter of going into the Amazon and cutting down part of the forest to be able to supply fertilizer. It's been an extraordinary moment in history, world history, to see what we've gone through, and I think President Biden is going to speak to that and deal with the future. I just had the opportunity this past month to go to Kyiv in Ukraine and to be able to see for myself the tremendous destruction that's taken place, but also the resolve that so many have there in regards to bringing together business, government, and society to be able to get them out of this situation once the military attacks have stopped. But that is foremost, I can tell you, foremost on President Biden's mind.
You say it's foremost on his mind, but you know, the president, I mean, do you expect him to push for a diplomatic solution to that conflict? This is a major diplomatic gathering that he will be at, because it seems he's doing the opposite. He's calling for more money, for more weapons for Ukraine.
Well, quite frankly, if President Biden, the United States, and the Western European allies had not stood behind Ukraine, Ukraine would have been taken over by Russian forces. And so the response to an invasion of this magnitude was really, there was no decision to be made as far as President Biden and the United States are concerned, but there had to be an effort to be able to take on this invasion that was not called for, and is from certainly the perspective of the United States and Western European powers considered to be an immoral war.
Anton, Fedyashin, the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, he will not be at the UN General Assembly. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, will be addressing the General Assembly. What can we expect from him?
I think he's going to be addressing the paradigm shift that we're seeing in global relations. I think the emphasis in Lavrov's speech is going to be the recalibration of global geopolitics, the emergence of the global South as a collection of new players with increased weight, led by China, India, and other states, but really a collection of states that are now going to be pursuing their own interests in a mutually respectful manner with each other, and holding a handout to the West to join them if it chooses to do so, but not expecting, not depending on the West's decisions any longer, the way it had been for about 300 years of modern history. I think that's going to be the emphasis. I don't expect much talk about the hopes for peace in Ukraine from the Russian side.
Anton, we did see a major turn in that conflict just in the past week when Ukrainian forces retook some of the territory that had been occupied by Russia. And in fact, it led to one analyst in Washington who's pretty well known. She's called Anne Applebaum, and she said, and I'm quoting here, "Americans and Europeans need to prepare for a Ukrainian victory that will bring about the end of Putin's regime," unquote. Do you think any of that's going to be addressed by Sergei Lavrov at the UN?
Well, he may talk about the issue of regime change. I doubt he'll bring it up in his speech, though, to be honest with you. It may be mentioned in the sidelines or in press conferences. But listen, this idea of getting rid of Putin is about 18 or maybe 17 years old, so I wouldn't exactly hold my breath. Unfortunately, the West has a pretty poor track record in regime change experiments over about the same period of time, over about 18 years. They inevitably result in cataclysms for the countries where they take place. And Russia, armed with nuclear weapons, I think guarantees that this will be even worse than Iraq, Syria, Ukraine, or any of the other states, Libya, where this has been tried.
Victor, the Chinese President Xi Jinping last week, he was joined by President Vladimir Putin as well as the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in Uzbekistan. They were there for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. What was your takeaway from those meetings, and what kind of message did that meeting send when we see these three leaders getting together there?
Well, SCO is becoming more and more relevant and impactful in the world of today. SCO is a peaceful organization focusing on joint efforts in fighting off extremism, radicalization, and terrorism on the one hand, but also increasingly focusing on connectivity and lifting the conditions which gave rise to radicalization to start with, and treating each member state as an equal and without allowing any member state to become a kind of overlord to impose its views onto other member states. In that sense, SCO is also becoming more and more attractive. More countries are lining up to apply to become new members of the SCO. And in this sense, SCO is in sharp contrast to other kind of organizations, for example, NATO, which keeps talking about war and defense and promoting conflict, etc. SCO talks about solutions and using peaceful means, using governance issues to uplift people from poverty, to solve energy problem, food problem, etc. This is exactly what the United Nations in the General Assembly wants to do for the whole world. Mm-hmm. So I think SCO going forward, especially involving countries like China, India, and Russia, can become a better example going forward.
James, the world is facing rising rates of inflation right now. We're seeing soaring energy costs as well. If we look at the relationship between China and the United States, I mean, there's a trade war that's still going on between these two countries. Janet Yellen, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, says the U.S. President is still considering whether to remove those trade tariffs. What's your prognosis on what's going on?
Well, quite frankly, I think that at the end of the day, the United States will come to some kind of an agreement with China that will allow for both countries to see that these kinds of sanctions no longer exist. The question is when. And so I would expect that after our midterm elections, after we get through this period, that we may see a real sit down to be able to discuss all this. I think, quite frankly, the United States was most impressed with this SCO conference, where indeed both Prime Minister Modi and President Xi were able to convey in no uncertain terms their concerns over what's happening in Ukraine, for example. And I think that that was music in the ears of an awful lot of Americans, including President Biden, in the sense that at least they were standing up to be able to say, look, you may have gone too far here, and you better understand exactly the concerns that we have about going too far.
Anton, the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, he will be addressing the United Nations General Assembly. He'll be doing that virtually. In fact, the UN made an exception to its rule that all leaders who address the Assembly must do so in person. What do you think he'll be saying?
Well, I think Zelensky is going to be talking about the importance of territorial integrity and international law, which is understandable given that he's the president of a country that has been invaded. And inevitably, he's going to ask for more weapons to support the Ukrainian war effort. The question is, you know, what is going to be the result? He'll be preaching to the choir when it comes to members of NATO and the entire global South, which contains, what, about 85% of the world's population, has not committed to getting involved in this conflict directly or taking sides and is staying out. So I imagine that very little will change as a result of President Zelensky's address, unfortunately, for Ukraine.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anton Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. reach consumers globally. Trade, manufacturing, energy, high-tech, real estate, consumption. We give an expanded view on global business and how it covers, influences, or relates to the whole world. Global business, only on CGTN.